So what I actually want to talk to you about are 4 things today, and I'm going to build a little bit on what Audra said and also what Chris said today. Very, very interesting presentations. First thing I'm going to focus on is the planning, and that's what I'm going to look at, the 7 steps. Next, I'm going to move into some key concepts. And again, these are useful things that you can take away and use straight away. Third thing I'm going to look at is people, because people make decisions. We have processes, but people and individuals make decisions. And the more we understand about them, the easier it is for us to be able to pitch and tailor our pitch to them. And the final thing I'll share with you today is, again, a useful structure for you to be able to put your pitch together. And this would apply to a meeting or to a formal pitch or an informal pitch. And one of the things I always say is that even when you're meeting informally, that too in itself is a pitch, because people form impressions about you, your ideas, your products, your services, and your organization. So let's start by just having a look to begin with at that first step, which is the planning. And to begin with, what we need to think about is, who are we actually talking to? Before we actually start to put together our quad chart, we need to think about who we're actually talking to. What's their rank? What's their relationship? Are they key influencers? Are they decision makers? Are they hangers-on? What's their level of understanding with regard to what it is that we're actually pitching? And one of the things I'll often say here is, never overestimate the intelligence of the people you're pitching to, because probably where you're pitching your product or service, you're very, very deep in that, and other people are not necessarily as deep into that. So don't make assumptions on those sorts of things. Now, picking up on what Chris was actually saying, the more you know about the individual, the easier it is to pitch. So it is important to know, where they come from, what their background is, what their work is, what their family is. All of that information is useful to you at some stage during the pitch as you build rapport. The second step is to think in terms of outcomes and objectives. Now, what I mean by that is, when they actually walk away from your meeting, what do you want them to think? When they're stopped and they say, "What did you think of X, Y, Z?" They're not going to trot off a whole load of methodology. What they're going to say is, very professional, knew their stuff. I could see us working well together. So what are the three to 5 things that you really want them to have at the very top of their mind when it comes to thinking about you and your product and your service and your business? I'll give you an example. I was involved with a team who it was a consortium, so a lot of collaboration, and we were actually pitching to one entity. It was a very large project, tens of millions of dollars, well, actually hundreds of millions of dollars. And the one thing we wanted them to take away from it was that one project, one team. And what we wanted to demonstrate was how the 3 partners that we were actually putting together could actually really deliver one project, one team. So that was the one simple thing. This becomes the focus of the next step, which of course is the content. What is it that we actually want to say? One of the key things to bear in mind here is to recognize that people do not have a flipped top head. So what I mean by that, it's not the volume of information. You need to think about less is more. I mean, Chris was talking before about how much information there is actually out there in the world. To give you an example, in the last 1 minute, there have been so many videos uploaded to YouTube that it would actually take you 2 solid days to watch the number of videos that have been uploaded to YouTube in the last 60 seconds. So less is more. It needs to be very, very tailored. And this is where you need to think about, what is the evidence that proves what I'm actually saying is true? So just because you say something is true, and Audra picked up on this a little bit in her presentation looking at the quad charts, where is the evidence to prove what it is that we're actually saying. So, for example, you could use a case study. And the way to use a case study is quite simple. Here's what we actually were looking at. This was the state of play. This is what we did. And finally, this was the outcome. This was the result. So a very, very simple 3-step process. You can also use things like stats, facts, quotes from other people. You can actually use some of the logos of companies you're working with. The way to think about the power of using those logos, which Audra talked about with regard to the quad charts, is instead of putting up 10 or 15 organizations that you actually work with, and when that happens, some people look at that and go, I'm not sure what that logo is, who's that? But imagine actually putting up just 3 or 4 logos of organizations that New Zealand Defence or MOD hold in high regard or already work very closely with. And that's what I'm talking about when it comes to tailoring that content to prove what you say is true. Another thing to use is repetition as well. So it could be the repetition is performance. Now, once we've done that, it's useful to have a framework and a structure. Quad chart is a framework and a structure. It helps you to reduce your preparation time, and the structure I'm going to show you will help you to do that. It also helps the people that you're talking to remember and retain information. So I'll take you through that in a few minutes. Outside of that, on the next step is actually to ensure you've got that visual support. And again, it's useful, as Audra said today, you know, a picture paints 1,000 words. So think about how you present is how you are, and the visuals that you actually use. For example, in interacting with people, as Chris used today, a very good whiteboard is a very, very useful tool to actually use. The dynamics. So the dynamics is how we present, and how we present is how we actually are. So our voice, our hands, our movement, our eye contact, all of these things happen in clusters, and they give an impression to the other person. I mean, even if you've spoken to somebody on the phone that you've never met before, you will have an impression of what they actually look like. So we are a very, very visual organism. And so these things are very, very important, even in a meeting sense. Showing that we're really interested, that we're present, as Chris said, is very, very important. So that the dynamics of how we actually deliver information is very, very important as well. The final step is thinking about rehearsal. So it's great to perform, but the best impromptu things are very well rehearsed. So make sure you do rehearse. The written word is always different from the spoken word. Make sure you actually rehearse these things. So in a nutshell, those are 7 tips to actually help you present your case as strongly as possible. Now let's just have a look at some key concepts. Now the first one here links very nicely into what Chris was actually saying before. Whenever there are people make decisions as individuals, so there's a me and there's a you, and you've got 2 people there, not very good stick people, but they are stick people. Now, a question I have for you is, when you're in a meeting, what percentage of the time are you there physically? It's not a trick question. It's a pretty easy question to answer. And the answer, of course, is you're there 100% of the time. But the next 2 steps are, what percentage of the time are you there mentally and emotionally? So, for example, if you're already thinking about the next meeting, or you're thinking about something that happened previously in the day, you're not there 100% mentally, and therefore you're not there 100% emotionally. And what that means is you don't pick up that vital information that you can get from that meeting, because you stop being there, you start being distracted, you start to focus on what you're going to say as opposed to what the other person is actually saying. So the thing that I would actually say to you is, picking up on Chris's point, is make sure you are present, or as I say, actually be there 100% physically, mentally, and emotionally. The next key concept for you is what I call closing the logically. And again, this is something you can use straight away in every aspect of your life, actually. It actually came to me when my daughter decided she needed a new horse many years ago, and she didn't close the logically. But you'll see what I mean in a moment. So there we have an X and a Y axis. So we have understanding on the vertical axis, and we have time on the horizontal axis. And this is really where you're at with the person you're speaking to, in this sense, in this case, Ministry of Defence or New Zealand Defence Force. So you're talking about, perhaps it might be something to do with technology. Something quite topical at the moment here in New Zealand, of course, is cyber attacks. And your understanding over a period of time, doesn't matter what that period of time is, but your understanding of the problem and the possible solutions will go up like that. However, the person you've met with, or the people that you've met with, their understanding often stays pretty much the same. And then you have what I term the logic leap. And what that is you try and take the person or the people you've been speaking to that are on the lower level there to try and bridge the gap to where your thinking actually is. Defence, MOD, most businesses do not like surprises. So in trying to bridge that logic leap, it's just too big a leap to actually breach. I'll give you a very quick example. There was a PR agency who had a the principal of the PR agency had a very strong relationship with the managing partner of a large accounting firm. And the large accounting firm went to them, and of course they went to a number of other agencies as well. But these people had the inside track because of that relationship. And they said, look, we really want to make sure that our image is something that is much more modern and in keeping with the 21st century. So go away, that's the brief. And they went away, PR agency went away and did a lot of very interesting things, a lot of very creative things. And then they actually pitched those creative ideas to them. They didn't win the business. And when the principal of the PR agency, when she went to actually speak to the managing partner of the accounting firm, he basically said, look, unfortunately, your ideas were just too out there for us. So they hadn't actually closed the logic leap. So what would have been useful would have been this little dotted line there, where from receiving the brief and actually coming back and actually pitching the idea, look to close that logic leap. So look to say, hey, I'll come back to you in a couple of weeks and here's what we're thinking of. What do you think of that? So again, think about, have I actually closed the logic leap with the people that I'm working with? The next key concept I want to share with you is the importance of the pitch itself. So in the US, where they do most of the research, and you've probably seen something similar to this, is that they asked chief executives what they remembered about meetings and presentations that they actually went to. 53% of what they took away was how it was done. So that's the atmosphere in the room, that's the quality of the presentation, that's the people themselves, their visuals, their voice. It's the how things. 40% was the who. So, of course, Chris is a world-renowned speaker. And, of course, people actually say, oh, it's Chris Hyder. So he has much more gravitas than somebody like myself. So the who is very important as well. It's 40% of what people remembered. And if my mathematics is correct, that leaves us with 7%, which is the what. Now, if I were to ask you, where do you spend most of your time when it comes to preparing for meetings, preparing for pitches, it's probably on the what you're actually going to present, what you're actually going to put across, what questions you're actually going to ask. And as Disraeli said, lies, damn lies, and statistics. So we could change those stats around slightly and say you're dealing with somebody very analytical, especially you could be in technology. And we could say that how, that they could actually be 33% on the how, 40% on the who, and then 27% on the what. Even so, there's an awful lot on the how. So don't neglect the how and think about how you position the who. you still need to make sure the what's there, because if you talk rubbish, people know you're actually talking rubbish. I've seen that a few times as well, and I'm sure you have as well. The final key concept for you is 4 things to do at a meeting. 4 very, very simple things to do. And again, you know, Chris actually alluded to this in his presentation. First thing to do is to build rapport. And of course, he used that for the family, the occupation, and what was the other thing? Family, occupation, what you do to relax. So 4 things to do to me. Look to actually build rapport as much as possible. Talk about them. As Voltaire said, judge a man by his questions and not his answers. So ensure that you actually ask lots of questions, because that really does demonstrate your understanding. So less about pitching your ideas, more about asking questions so you better understand their position. And there are some really great questions to ask. One question I will often ask at the very beginning of every meeting is, how much time have we got? Often people, we've set aside an hour for the meeting, but something's come up for that other person, and they'll say, look, if we could do this in 30 minutes, because unfortunately, I've got a back-to-back meeting which has been imposed upon me, then I know how much time I've actually got. Another useful question that I use when I come towards the end of the meeting is there anything else I should know? And that's an amazing question to open up, where they actually share some stuff which they probably haven't shared today. Third thing to do is a little bit of fishing. So what I mean by that, to use the analogy of fishing, sometimes you can go out fishing and you can use mackerel as a bait and the fish aren't biting. But if you put on some squid, all of a sudden they are biting. So throw in some ideas. Have you thought about this? What about that? Do a bit of fly fishing. The final thing of the 4 things is always look to add value, to give something of value to the other person. It's not something physical, it's not pens or anything like that, as you well know. I'll give you an example. An FMCG, fast-moving consumer goods client of mine who has an 80% share in the market they're actually in, I was actually talking to the general manager, and I said to him towards the end, something that I do quite naturally, so it wasn't staged. I said, I came across a Guardian long read that you actually might find really interesting. And it was on the birth and the rise and also the fall of Nespresso. And he said, oh, no, that'd be really interesting. So again, you can see how these things all work together to build that rapport and help you to pitch your ideas. All right, the penultimate stage now. Let's have a look at the structure. What is the structure that we can actually put these ideas into? So the first part is looking at the housekeeping. So I will often clarify in people's minds, and for example, in a meeting, as I said, one of the questions I ask is, how much time have we actually got? It's also when I say things like, look, don't worry about taking notes. I've got a full pack here which you can take away. And look, I know you don't know the person to my left or to my right, but they are X, Y, Z. The next line you can see there is a hook, and a hook is optional. It's a creative, and it's a device that hooks you into your subject. So, for example, a topical hook at the moment would be to say, how many of you know who Mark Peterson actually is? And some of you might say, oh yeah, I know who he is, but most people will probably say no. I say, well, in actual fact, he's the chief executive of NZX. And of course, they have been having a tough time lately with regard to some cyber attacks. So I'm pretty sure nobody wants to be Mark Peterson today. And what I want to talk to you about is cybersecurity for defense. And that's the subject. The next 3 boxes going across there are your agendas. Now, there could be 4, so this could be part of your quad charts. But agenda 1, in this instance, it could be saying, so what I want to talk to you about today, or what I want to explain, is an understanding of what's happening in the cyber landscape out there at the moment. Then I want to have a look at what the options are that we have actually developed to deal with this. and finally, how these options would be implemented and how they could work for you. The next 3 boxes are the bodies, and they relate to each of those agendas. So body 1 would be around painting the landscape of what's happening with regard to cybersecurity right here, right now. And that's where you'd use a lot of very good examples. And those examples would illustrate how strongly you know this area. Body 2, obviously, you'd have a lot more evidence on what are the various options and services that you actually provide. And part 3 might be a flow chart of how we go about the implementation and talking about some successful implementations of working with other big industry players that New Zealand Defence, MOD could actually relate to and actually say, gosh, that's fantastic evidence. Now, in any pitch, any presentation, people actually tune out all the time. So it's important that you have summaries at the end. So at the end of body 3, you would actually say, so let me just pull all this together. So as you can see, there has been a real change with regard to the type of cyber attacks we're seeing on major institutions at the moment. And that's summary 1, then you do summary 2, summary 3. And the final step is the next step, the conclusion, where to from here. So that's a very, very simple chart. I've developed something like 60 different agendas. Word of caution here, don't have any more than 5 agendas. Most things can fit into 3. You can have 4, that works well for the quad charts. But again, giving this structure to people helps them to retain the information, and it also reduces your preparation time as well. All right, let's have a look at people, because people are what actually make decisions. It's not an organization, it's people within those organizations. So I'm going to take you on a very, very brief overview about what makes people tick and the type of people that you actually deal with. So as I'm running through this, have a think to yourself about the sort of people that you actually work with and the sort of people that you actually pitch to. So let's start to begin with in this area here, which is just the bottom right. And this is based on Jung's late 19th century, early 20th century thinking. And this is what I term the analytical and thinker. So somebody who has a lot of characteristics in this particular quadrant, basically, if you were to boil it down into a simple phrase, would actually say, show me you know. So we all have some analytical tendencies in the way that we actually think, but some are greater than others. So if I were to drop a pebble into the crosshairs there, somebody who is very, very strong analytical thinker would be much closer to the crosshairs there. And the sort of things that they think about, detail is important, the logic, processes, looking for hard evidence that you can actually do this work. They like agendas. They're happy to take time and talk about the options. They also can be quite black-hatted in the sense of thinking about minimizing risk and the past and problems. So often people who are trained as lawyers are very strongly analytical, for example. Not all of them, but again, this is just something to stimulate your thinking, to think about how you actually pitch to the individuals concerned. Let's have a look at the next quadrant, and that's what I term the driver. So Jung called it the sensor. I think that sensor is something that doesn't really explain it fully enough. That's why I've put driver there, but I've given you the Jung's nomenclature as well. And what they basically say, and we all say this to a degree, is what's in it for me? What's in it for me? So the sort of things that are important are results. What are the results? What is the bottom line? Their time is often short. So for example, if you are meeting with them and you've got a meeting that is scheduled to go 45 minutes, make sure you finish it within 30. They can be quite intimidating. And yeah, I mean, I do remember one individual I worked with, and he was 6'5". He had a bad back, so he had a stand-up desk, and he was very, very intimidating. And I gave him some feedback on that because it wasn't working so well for his team. And in a very direct way, he said, "Thank you very much. I'm quite happy with what I actually do." So get to the point. Have a focus with somebody who's very much a driver. This is what Jung calls the intuitor, I call the creative. What they say is, excite me. And we all say that to a degree. People like Richard Branson are big into being a creative intuitor. He surrounds himself with good analytical people and also drivers, interestingly enough. But they're very interested in the big picture. So if your natural tendency is to deal in a lot of detail, think about, as Chris said, we all sell. And often, you know, one of the phrases used is, think about selling to yourself. What would you buy? I actually say, look, think about selling in a way that the other person likes to be sold to. So these people who are strong creatives don't like detail as a rule. They're looking to maximize the opportunity as opposed to minimizing risks of the analytical. And they like to be involved. So any meeting, any presentation you do, get them involved. Make sure that they don't actually switch off. The final quadrant is what I term the amiable, because unfortunately Jung used the term feeler, which in today's world is not a thing that you want to be known as. So what they say, and we all say this today, is, do I actually trust you? So the characteristics of people with strong characteristics in this particular quadrant is relationships are important. So you need to take the time. So you can imagine if you're a strong driver sensor, you look to get straight to the heart of the matter. But somebody who's an able feeler says, oh, I don't know you. So you need to take the time. They like a lot more background about you, where you've come from, what's gone on. They will often avoid tension. So if you put a lot of pressure on them, they won't return your calls. They sometimes lack a degree of urgency. They're often in organizations, the glue that hold an organization together. So let's give you a quick overview of the people that you're dealing with, and some things to actually think about there as well. So what have we seen? When it comes to pitching, it is all about the other person, the who. So the more knowledge you have on that person, for example, in war room methodology, I usually accumulate an awful lot of information on all the individuals and how they make decisions. Think in terms of outcomes. At the end of my meeting, at the end of my presentation, what are the 3 to 5 things I want them to think about me, my organization, our product and our service? What are the outcomes? And you need to spend a bit of time on that. I also talked to you about the logic leap. Make sure you close the logic leap. One example, I remember working with one particular client, we didn't close the logic leap internally with the chief executive, who was just about to retire and decided to pull a $60 million project, which we were pitching, where we already had the inside running. So the logic leap applies internally as well as externally. Think about the how versus the what. The what's important, that is important, getting that detail right, but how you do it, the intention you actually have, is very, very important. And it's those things, that movement, gesture, eye contact, for example, as well. And the final thing I shared with you was the framework, which helps you to put the quad chart, if you're using quad charts, into a framework, and that will save you a lot of time. So, as I said before, Vince Lombardi said it better than me, the will to win is important, but the will to prepare is absolutely vital. And if there's one thing you take away from my presentation today, it is ensure that you prepare. Thank you very much.
Hi, David.
Hello, Jenny.
Fabulous presentation as always. So thank you very much. So I've got a couple of questions for you. So, traditionally when we pitched, we would have been doing more face-to-face pitching. So that would give us the opportunity to share some of the cultural aspects of why we'd be good people to work with from a relationship trust perspective. So if the customer ends up with two products that look like they could do the same thing and they're interested, they like the culture of one. So in the face-to-face environment, portraying that culture and expressing that is easier. If people are now pitching more often straight through with a printed document and or in a digital environment, any tips, ideas for how you can better portray that cultural team aspect of your organization so that it doesn't get lost in the one dimension of paper?
I think that I think the key thing there is really think very carefully about what you want them to think. So the outcomes, what do we want them to think? What do we want them to do? What are the 3 to 5 things that really resonate about us? And then all you're thinking about is what are the channels that we're actually going to use. So whether that's in a written form or whether it's in a remote form. One of the things that I would say about using platforms like this or Zoom or Microsoft Teams is people's attention span is less, and you really do need to really refine your message because people can very easily tune out, and make sure you're consistent. So go back to those things. Think, who am I pitching to? And what are the 3 to 5 things that I really want them to take away? So that when they actually make a decision to work with you, and somebody says to them, why did you decide to work with this particular organization? They say, well, they were 1, 2, 3. So think about that and then get that right. And then say, right, how do we convey that through the channel, through each of those channels that we actually use, the face-to-face, the remote, and the written word.
Awesome. Thank you. And then final question. So I know what Jane's going to say when she comes on to talk, and she's going to talk a little bit about intellectual property. But so I wanted to know, when you're advising people on preparing their pitches, how do they strike the balance between providing enough to show that they really do have solutions, but not so much that they're actually giving away their magic and IP at the pitching stage before they've won the work?
Yeah, that is an interesting question. And I think it's changed a lot in the 20 years that I've done business. And I remember my daughter actually saying to me a few years ago when we were putting together some workbooks for some workshops I was running, she said, Dad, this stuff's actually quite good. You actually need to protect it, intellectual property. And I said, yeah, well, my pockets are not that deep, so I just have to keep on coming up with ideas. One of the things that I think is very, very important is give away as much as you can. Be generous with what you actually give, because even when you're giving concepts and ideas, the implementation is where the magic actually does happen. And that's where, so for example, you know, the amount of information that we have access to nowadays, for example, if you were to go onto Wikipedia and actually look to just read all of the articles that are written in English on Wikipedia, and you read 200 articles a day, it would take you 80 years to read all of those articles. So what I'm saying is there's a lot of information out there. So obviously if you've got some proprietary stuff, you're not going to let that go, but be as generous as possible. Your job is to actually win the business, and actually show that you've got a solution for the headache that they've actually got. So that comes back down to making sure that evidence is really, really tight. And for example, if you haven't, like I talked about a case study where you have, here's the situation, this is the action we took, this was the solution we put in place, and this was the result. If you haven't done that before, then here's the hypothetical case study. But use strong case studies. Will go a long way to actually overcoming feeling as though you're giving away intellectual property. I mean, people could argue I've given away intellectual property today. To me, it's just information, and I think that it's about actually sharing. I really do.
Awesome.